Hello everyone, thank you very much for joining me again. Today I will answer one of the questions I got this week, and I think I got this week about 100 questions, but this one is, I find it very important and very practical, and it's related to JPA implementations and to a subject that you will find there's potentially very big chances you will find in real world applications, and that's the usage of DTOs with JPA implementations. So yeah, I still find that this subject is not really clear to many of you, and many who start learning JPA, they go to the first, like the most used implementation. They'll start learning Hibernate, which is fine, is what we most likely use today. They learn about entity classes, they learn about relationships, they learn about the context and operations that you can do on the context, but don't necessarily learn some more subtle things. And one of these things that are not necessarily directly encountered and found in even in books that I know and I have read is the usage of DTOs with JPA. When do we use DTOs instead of entities? How do we use DTOs instead of entities? So these are questions that I would like to answer today. But first of all, let me make sure that you understand the very basics of JPA. So let me make sure that you know what we are discussing about here. And then I will start, of course, as you already know I'm usually doing, I will start a new project. I already created a small table in a database, and what I would like to do is prove you how to use DTOs with JPA. So first of all, we discussed JPA. JPA is Java Persistence API, and this is a specification. It's very important to remember this is a specification, and it's not an implementation. So it's just a specification telling you how to work with object relational mapping, which means a mapping in a context, the records in a relational database, and operate upon them. And there are multiple implementations of JPA, probably the most known being Hibernate. And Hibernate is anyway even the convention in Spring Boot applications. So today it's very unlikely that you don't use Hibernate if you use JPA, because most likely you don't override the defaults, so that you will behind the scenes use JPA. So in many cases today, people even start confusing Hibernate with JPA, or they consider this the same thing. It's not the same thing. JPA is just the specification and Hibernate is an implementation. Okay, but what does actually ORM mean? So ORM means in your application you have a context, and this context, this is the context, this is managed by a framework. So in our case, say it's managed by Hibernate. So whenever we select something from the database using any kind of query that we need, an object is created in this context. And this object, which can be, for example, if you have a products table, then you most likely have a product class, and this product class is annotated with an annotation which is at entity. And then this instance, when you select it, it's added to this context, and then it's managed by Hibernate. Of course, putting an instance in the context is not necessarily upon a select. You can, for example, create a new product, and then you can use the so-called persist operation. The persist operation, contrary to the opinion of many, it's not creating an insert. An insert query is, of course, at the very end pushing the values in the database. But when you persist an entity, and what happens is just that this object it's added to the context. And then depending on how you configure your operations, at some point, usually being the end of the transaction, this context will be mirrored into the database. So that's when what Hibernate tries to do at the very end, or the JPA implementation you use, it tries to mirror this context, and all the changes that you have done in the entities or in the context, they will transform into SQL queries, which will reflect into changes in your tables in the database, in the data. So what happens is that, for example, if you have an entity in the context, if you have an instance in the context, you might already know, if you are using or studying now JPA, that it's only enough to say set price or set name or whatever attribute, and you don't need to save or do anything like call a specific operation at the very end of the transaction just because the price has been changed. Let's assume the price was 5 and then you set it to 10. You don't need to do anything else. At the very end, the context will be mirrored, and then this change will transform most likely into an update product set price 10, where ID is and the value of the ID which is on the instance. Cool. But we were discussing DTOs, okay? So why did I start with all this? Why did I start with the context? And I wanted to make sure that you understand the philosophy behind the scenes. It's because it's true that in most cases we will use entities, and the whole idea is that when you use an ORM implementation, yes, instead of sending the SQL queries directly, you manage a context, and then at the very end, the framework makes sure to mirror it to the database. But when you don't have changes, you just grab data from the database, but you don't want to change it, you just want to expose it, then one of the things you can do to improve your performance is, instead of grabbing the data and putting it into the context, you can grab the data and put it outside of the context. And that's what you can do if instead of entity classes, you use DTOs, which DTO stands for Data Transfer Object. And this is a concept where we use instances of an object to get data from somewhere and put it somewhere else. For example, when we exchange data between two applications. But the same concept we can use here, just named DTOs, because there are some objects we use to grab data from the database, but instead of putting it in the framework's context, in Hibernate's context, we put the data outside of the Hibernate's context. And the only thing you need to do is, instead of using an entity class, just use a class that's not an entity. So it's not like so difficult what a DTO versus a non-DTO class is here. When we say entity, it's a class that you have marked appropriately using the entity annotation. When you say we use DTOs with Hibernate, we mean we are using a class that is not annotated with entity, and that the JPA implementation, the JPA framework you use, doesn't recognize it as an entity. So whenever you grab it from the database and take that information to use it, instead of being added to the context, it's outside of the context. Why is that relevant? Is because once you grab the data, nothing happens to it anymore. It's obviously only your choice what you do with the data once it's outside of the context. So if you want to process it anyhow, it's your choice, but Hibernate won't touch it. Which is not the case of what happens when you grab data and put it in the context. Because then there are many things that can happen depending on your configuration. So when you put it in the context, there are things that can happen, and there are situations where even if you don't change anything, Hibernate will still have to parse through all the objects and do some verifications, do some validations, and this can take time. And for example, if your purpose is just to grab 1000 records from the database, just to put them on an endpoint, without any reason of changing them, deleting them, do something, operate on the data somehow, you just want to grab the data and expose it, for example, and you have many records you want to expose, then it's much relevant to you work with data outside of the context than work with data inside of the context. Because if you know you don't change at all, for example, these values, then it doesn't make sense anyway to put them in the context to just let Hibernate validate once more that you didn't change anything, for example. And in these cases, you will improve a lot the performance, and depending on the number of the records you use, you might see very valuable improvement in the speed. And I mean here, even if you don't, again, if you don't save data, it might still take longer for Hibernate to just grab that data, because at the very end of the transaction, it still has to validate your context is the same with your database. And if it's not, of course, as we said earlier, create the SQL queries that will mirror the context to the database. But if you don't want that, then why let your framework struggle with 1000 instances when it doesn't need to struggle, because you don't know, you don't do any changes, you just grab data and expose it somewhere. And that's why very often when you use DTOs, you will make them immutable. Okay, you make the instances immutable. That means once the instance is created, you don't change it anymore, and it makes a lot of sense. So with that being said, let me show you how it works. Let's actually create a project, because we will try with the same table to use both entities and DTOs and see what happens. Oh, and by the way, I created already a very small table with 2 rows, because that's everything we need for the moment. And as you can see, it's only an ID, a name, and the price, and I had to use my IntelliJ for that, because 10 minutes before this stream, my MySQL workbench stopped working, and I couldn't figure out a way to make it work again, so I connected to a database directly through my IntelliJ. It's not something I usually do, so if you see me struggling with this now, it's because it's the first time I actually do that. I either use DataGrip if I want to use a JetBrains product, or I'm simply using for my demonstrations MySQL workbench. So let me see, and hopefully this will work. So how do we call this? So say JPA with DTOs. Okay, so JPA with DTOs, and I will create a simple web application, and then I will say what do I actually need. I need a MySQL driver definitely, and I will just use Spring Data JPA, but again, this is not related to Spring Data. Okay, I'm just using Spring Data JPA because it's easier for me. It's a high level layer that allows me to skip some configurations. I don't want to lose a lot of time now. But in what I'm showing you here is related to any kind of Hibernate or any other JPA implementation you use. Is the same thing that I'm showing you here. So web, JPA, and MySQL driver, and hopefully that should be enough for our today's demonstration. So let's create this. Okay, have new window, and I will wait just a bit for my IntelliJ to finish indexing all the dependencies. And then I will start by creating the entities. I'll create two different classes. I'll create an entity and the DTO. So yeah, basically that's it. Oh, and I see some questions, so let me take your questions while it's still indexing and say, so will ORM use JDBC for performing queries? The answer is yes. Behind the scenes, there will always be JDBC when you work with relational databases. So remember that when you have ORM or any other framework you have, behind the scenes, you always have JDBC. So ORM will, at the very end here, use JDBC to send the queries, okay? So the JDBC is the low-level way to work with a relational database. You can use it directly. You can use it, for example, directly, like just through the interfaces, through the contracts in the JDK. You can use it through templates, such as JDBC template, for example, Spring provides. You can use it through Hibernate or any other JPA implementation. You can use it through Spring Data JPA, which behind the scenes uses Hibernate, which behind the scenes uses JDBC. So at the very end, yes, there will be JDBC that is used. So that's very right. And then can a security related issue occur if we use entities instead of DTOs? No, I don't see anything that could be related to using DTOs versus entities in terms of security. So in the end, they are still objects, both of them. One of the objects being part of the context, while the other one is not part of the context. Okay, so but there is no difference. Like if you have security issues, you can get those vulnerabilities with or without DTOs or with or without entities. By using DTO, we separate the DB layer from the web layer. So that's something for which the answer would be yes, but the discussion I'm taking here is not related to the web layer. It's like using DTOs directly to grab data from the database. So there's a question with very debatable answers on the internet. If you'll search, the question is, when I have an endpoint, should I directly expose the entity or should I use a DTO instead? But that's not what we are discussing here today. Today I'm not discussing if at the web layer, if at the controller layer you should use entities or DTOs. The answer from my perspective is both can be used depending on your case, but let's take a separate video for that. So what I'm discussing here is when should you use DTOs instead of entities directly when you grab the data with JPA, because you can do that. If you didn't know, now it's time for you to learn that. It's a very important technique, a very good technique that will help you in real world applications improve your app's performance, okay? What if I differently use select query and get the exposed data on endpoint? I'm not sure what this question referred to. Is it okay to ask questions regarding Spring security? Yes, but I won't answer them now. So maybe it's better if you like either find me on Twitter or LinkedIn, or you simply leave those Spring security questions for a Spring security video so I can answer those at that time, okay? Can I log all SQL queries using my JDBC? Yes, you can log them and you can even profile them. I have some nice technique. I've just proved in one of my latest book, actually, how to read Java and how can you profile the queries. And this is part of a new series. No, it's just some random video. I'm random live event to answer a question. Okay, with that being said, it's time to actually like create our project, because then you will get bored. I'm pretty sure you don't want you to get bored. And what I'm going to do is define the model of my application, and inside the model of my application I will have two different packages, one of them called entities and the other one called DTOs. And in the entities I'm going to add a class product, and remember, let me see if I can see my database from this window as well. No, I can't, so I'll just go back to avoid losing the time. So it's about this table ID name price, the products table ID name price. This is what we are mapping, okay? So I'm mapping it to this product class, and then I say I will make it an entity because it's in the entities package, okay? And then I will have to add table and say that the table is in fact products because it has a different name. So if you have a different name, you have to do that. And then I say private int ID generated value because I made it auto increment. So I say strategy, sorry, generated value strategy identity. What do I need? Private string name, and I need a private. I usually use big decimals, so I don't use double, but for the moment I think it's okay. And then of course getters and setters. I didn't add Lombok to my dependencies, so I'll have to simply generate the getters and setters. And this is a normal entity. Now, how does a DTO look like? So I will create a DTO for my products, and I will say product DTO. And then one of the things that I would like to show you about the product DTO, it's just a normal object. And since we usually create it immutable, and that's a big difference that I would like to make between the product and the product DTO, I will make it a record since I'm using Java 17, and that can be a surprise. I'm not sure if it's a surprise or not for you, but a DTO being that you usually make it immutable. Yeah, you can use a class, that's totally fine. But since you have this opportunity now with Java 17, you can make it a record directly. So how do I say here? Int ID string name double price. So you see, it's basically the same thing. I'm not sure why my indexing is taking so long. So I hope I don't have some problems now with my IntelliJ, because I really want to show you this working. So, but the idea is that the product versus the entity is that I didn't have, it's just a normal object. You see, it's a normal object. I made it a record for the sake of using Java 17 and the easiness of making it immutable. You can see that here I had to use entity. I have to use the table annotation because the name of the table is different than the name of the class. I had to use annotations, and very importantly, a difference here, everything is mutable. So you cannot have immutable entities because the whole JPA specification forces into mutability. To update something through Hibernate, you have to change the value of the field. So you see, you need mutability. You cannot make your entity immutable. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to update things anymore. But the DTOs will usually be immutable. Because again, when do you use DTOs with JPA is when you bring data from the database and you want to put it outside of the context, so you know that anyway you will not change them. And to be very clear for everyone that they shouldn't change, or at least shouldn't rely on any changes, then you make them immutable. It's the cleanest way to tell everyone, I'm creating a record, I'm creating an immutable object here, and the reason I'm creating it immutable is because I'm going to use it to take data from the database and put it outside of the JPA context, so that JPA will not anyway see it, and because of that, JPA will not, my JPA implementation will not anyway mirror anything that I would change. And then you don't have any expectation that some developer will change the value and expect and don't understand why it doesn't change in the database, because it won't change in the database, okay? And now let's further implement the repository. So I'm going to create the repositories. Okay. And product repository. And then extend JPA repository. Here we necessarily have to have an entity, okay? So it's product, which is the entity, integer, which is the type. Oh, not product repository, but product is what I need here. Extremely slow, my IntelliJ today, extremely slow. I'm wondering why it takes so much to index the dependencies. Anyway, so let me try answer your question meanwhile. So is it a good approach to make a DTO in Spring Boot project? It's unrelated to what kind of framework are you using. So yes, it's a good approach when you use it in the proper way, because you can use DTOs in a good way or in a bad way, and that can happen whether your project is Spring Boot or not. So it can be you use a plain Java application and you use a DTO in a good way, but it can be that you use it in a bad way. So it depends on what you do with the DTO and not on the technology you are using. And then we have, do you have a favorite library to automate DTO conversion? Again, that's related more to when you change like an entity to a DTO, but today I'm not showing you that. Today I'm showing you how you use the DTO to directly grab the data. But yes, I do like to use model mapper usually. So when I'm using it, the most used framework in my case, I think it's model mapper. But I don't say that I know all of them. I don't want to say that one is better than the other. I just seems to have fit better for me in my projects. Can we use records to create DTOs? Not only that we can, we usually we should. So the idea is, yes, usually it's a good approach if you have this possibility, because the records are here they are here with Java 14, but let me say 17 just because 17 is the latest long-term supported. If you don't have a Java version that offers you records, of course you can't use them. But if you have, then it's a good way. So is it recommended to use table name with entity? It's not that's recommended. It's a must in case the name of the table doesn't correspond with the name of the class. Like in my case, it's products, and here I have products. So if it's not the same, then it's a must. If you don't use table, then your JPA implementation will not know which is the table to look for. If the name of the table matches the name of the class, then you can skip on the table annotation. You don't need to use it, but just in that case. Otherwise, it's mandatory to use it. Where did this record come from? What is a record? So I will not completely answer you in this video because it's not about records, but record is a type of a class, a structure type that appeared in Java 14, and since I'm using 17 now, I should be able to use it. If you want to learn more about records, it's definitely that you will find some videos on the same channel where I discuss. So just search for record and you will find some examples that I made with records. Can we modify the data models as record instead of class? Wherever you need immutability and you have a Java version that allows you use records, then you can use records instead of having a normal class, yes. Should I make serializer for DTOs? If you don't use any IO stream to send them, then it doesn't make any sense to make them serialize, to make them implement the serializable interface. You will probably rarely see that in today's applications. You can do technically that, but I don't see where that would help you. Okay. And I see a lot of your questions have been answered. Now I'm going to go back to my product repository and try to write some queries, isn't it? So let's say I can say select product from how do I name it? Let's say find all, because we don't necessarily need to know. Now, of course, in a real world app, you would have a more complex query, but it's irrelevant to our today's example, isn't it? So what I want to say is that I'm going to prove the difference between entities and DTO usage. Then how complicated your queries are, it's irrelevant to the subject. So it can be complicated or not, okay? So in my case, to make this very simple, I will just say select P from product P, which is like the simplest query I can write, but the whole idea is do just compare, in my case, the usage of the entity versus the usage of the DTO, because it's irrelevant. The query is irrelevant for our example now, okay? And then the same thing, I will say select product DTO, find all DTO, and say query, which will be select new, and then I have to say model. What's com? It doesn't suggest me that I will have to write it. Example JPA with DTOs model product DTO, and then I will say from product P, and then I can say here P ID, P name, and P price. Okay, and basically what I did here, and I would like you to compare the two queries, is one of them, this is what most of you are used with. So this is taking entities and putting them in the JPA context, while this is taking objects and not putting them, or putting them, I'll say putting them outside of the JPA context. Okay, so what you see here is that instead of returning the entity, which can go very simply as that, I'm creating for every record a new instance of my DTO. So in the end, the result will be a list of DTOs. And because the object that I'm returning here is not an entity, then what happens is that the values will be placed outside of the JPA context. And then being outside of the JPA context, then once you grab them, you don't have them anymore anywhere. So let me see if I see some other questions from you here. So if I have select query with 3 tables, then do we need to map the result explicitly? I'm not sure if I understand the question. Yes, you need to map the result. If you have, I don't think it matters how many tables. If you have 1 or if you have 10, you have to map the result explicitly. If that was not a question, then please rephrase it and I will try to answer it. Using DTO with JPA make functions slower, do mapping between objects. I'm not sure again. So maybe we don't understand correctly what all of this is about. But the idea is here that we don't discuss about transforming entities in DTOs for the web layer. So what I'm trying to discuss here is how to use DTOs to grab object from the database. Okay, so of course, if what your question refers to is, does it take a longer time to transform entities in DTOs? Yes, of course, in that case it will take. In my case here, no, it's just creating an object, which would anyway happen somewhere behind the scenes. So it says cannot resolve symbol product DTO, but I'm pretty sure I wrote it. So com example JPA with DTOs, model DTOs, of course, DTOs, so the package name was not correct, and then product DTO. Hopefully that will work now. So you can see what I'm doing here. Okay, so no, it's not less performant. By the opposite, as I was saying, if you are working with DTOs, grabbing DTOs, putting them outside of the context in many cases, in those cases where you don't have operations on these objects, then it's more performant actually. Most cloud providers run on Java 8 and 11 if you are lucky. What do you do when you have developed your app in Java 17, for instance, where you don't need to, well, I'm not sure if I understand that, because you say most cloud providers run on 8 or 11. That's not true. You just take any cloud you have, you can create a virtual machine and you can create a container and install there whatever Java you need. What maybe you mean is most cloud providers still use Java 8 or 18 for functions and function as a service and serverless. That's another story. In that case, you implement your functions with Java 11 if you don't yet have 17. But mind, that's only for functions. Otherwise, that's what we are saying is not true, because you can have whatever Java you want in your container. You are the one creating your Docker image. It's not them. So you can run whatever you want. I know that repository does nothing here, but can we just use it for documentation purposes? I prefer not to use it because, well, the interface, it's already named product repository. Why put another repository there? Does it make any sense? For me, the simple fact that it's named repository and it extends JPA repository, it doesn't make sense to add just one more annotation simply just to have it for the third documentation purpose, because you have it once here, second here, you want a third marker that this is a repository. If you want, put it there, but I don't think it makes sense. Okay, I see there is some problem with YouTube, but I hope in the end it will be fine. I'm not sure if it's something I can do because my connection looks fine. I always use objects managed by the JPA context and works well. DTOs are bringing about duplicity when writing. It's not necessarily for duplicity, but whenever you, and I was at the beginning of the video showing that, whenever you get a lot of objects from the database, then you will see that there are operations that you can skip from the context. So I don't want to say that using DTOs it's a must, and I don't want to say that you should always use DTOs. By the contrary, in most cases you will use entities because that's why you are using an ORM framework. But this approach will save you when you need to, for example, grab a lot of objects from the database and then you want to skip to have your Hibernate or whatever JPA implementation you use paired of doing some operations of mirroring a large context, especially because, and that's something you should mind, Hibernate and JPA implementations, ORM implementations in general, they are not made for large context. They are not made for you to grab from the database 1,000 objects and put them there. The more instances you create in the context, the slower your application will be. So what you can do is sometimes when this helps you is just using the DTOs directly from the database, and that will help you do that. Okay, stream is fine now. IntelliJ was again hacking me. Hopefully that's fine now. Cool, and let's actually, I want to try it, isn't it? So let's just make a controller. And it's not a lot of that what you can try actually here is just to prove that both work the same, because you will not see a lot of things behind the scenes. You will just see that this syntax works and you can use it. But you have to understand what's the difference between this and that, and whenever it helps you, you can find DTOs very helpful. Okay, product controller, and then make this a REST controller, and then I create public list of product. Usually injecting the repositories directly. Oh, I don't have Lombok. Injecting repositories directly in the controller is not a thing to do in a real world app. So you will usually have a service, but I wanted to just spare some time. And then I'm just going to say product repository find all, which will be get mapping all, and then a second endpoint, all DTOs, get all DTOs, find all DTO, okay, which definitely returns DTO. Okay, and then in the resources, I'm gonna go to the application properties and set the data source URL, JDBC, MySQL, localhost, demo I think is the database, the data source username root, and just start and try to use this. Okay. Okay, next time I'm gonna see what I do with this IntelliJ, because I have a very, like, this computer is quite performant. It has over 40 gigabits of RAM, so I'm pretty sure it's not a problem with my computer. It's a problem with IntelliJ usually. So sorry for that. So I just find it okay. Thank you very much for your appreciation. I'm glad I'm glad you like my videos. So again, I wanted to make sure that everyone understands here this video is not about using DTOs at the web layer. It's everything about grabbing the data through DTOs directly through JPA. And the reason I wanted to show you that, and I will repeat it again at the very end, is that putting objects outside of the JPA context helps you when you have to just retrieve objects. You don't change them, but there are many. So in that case, of course, if you have like 10 objects or 100 objects, that's not a problem. But when you have 1,000, 10,000 objects, you will see that JPA implementations, they are not friends with getting too many objects from the context. Okay, so in that case, you will really find useful to work with DTOs directly from the context. So this is the all. You can see, okay, the two products I have, and then I can just open a different tab. All DTO, I think was the name. Let me see, all DTOs actually. Okay. So you see, it's the same thing. Okay. So what I managed to do is obtain the same result, but the difference is that directly from my JPQL query, I've been using the DTOs objects. And then what happens is that this makes sure that all the objects that are retrieved through JDBC behind the scenes, they will not go into the JPA context. And this is the very important stuff that you learned today, because not having them in the JPA context is what helps you save some performance. So let me actually draw from the beginning. So what happens is that I have a database, okay? This is my database. And the difference between find all and find all DTO So the two methods I have in my repository, so this is in my repository, is that findAll somehow through JDBC gets the values and puts them into the JPA context. While when you use the second method, I mean this one here, this one, when you use this one, where I'm not taking out the entities, similarly, through JDBC, it retrieves the data from the database. But instead of putting them in the JPA context, it puts the object outside of the JPA context. Now, remember that the JPA context and the context in general in any ORM is what the framework mirrors to the database. So the big difference is that if I'm changing now this object here, if I try to change it, this will not reflect in the database. So the change will not reflect in the database because being outside of the context, the framework doesn't know anything about these objects here. Okay? While if I'm changing this object, then at the end of the transaction, the change will be mirrored to the database. So you see a very, very big difference. Now, why in the end, if I don't change anything, why should I use DTOs sometimes and not the entities? Because if I select many objects, the difference is that these many objects, even if you don't change them, Hibernate is still managing them. So if you have here 10,000 or more instances, the more you have, the more difficult will be for Hibernate to manage them. Of course, if you would have them and you need to change them, then if you have too many, what I can conclude is that a JPA implementation, or in general an ORM implementation, should or may, I think may is better, may not be what you need. Because again, JPA and ORM implementations, they are not silver bullets. They don't fit well in all your use cases. So when you choose in your application design to use an ORM, JPA or whatever that is, remember that these frameworks, they do use a context and they do manage the context, and the more objects you put in that context, which is in the end a collection, it's like a list of objects, isn't it? The more objects you have in the list and you want to operate on them, the longer the list is, the more difficult it will be to operate on the objects, okay? So if you, however, have cases where you grab a lot of objects, like you grab 10,000, 100,000 objects, but it's only to get them and put them somewhere. Maybe for some reason you need to get all of them, but then you don't need to change them back. Now, if this is only one case, then maybe it still makes sense to use JPA. But in that case, you would prefer to use DTOs to get that large number of objects, since you already know you will not operate on them to make changes at the very end in the database. And that's why it makes a lot of sense. It's not mandatory, but it makes a lot of sense usually to make these DTOs immutable. And that's why in my case I used records. It's again not a must to use records. You might not have them if you don't have a Java version supporting records, but if you have them, that's what creates you immutable objects out of the box. Okay, let me see what you okay, shared indexes would be an idea. Okay, just to be clear, here it means JPA persistence context, right? Yes, JPA persistence context, that's what I meant. Can you demo me an object in the JPA context is changed, an update is sent to a database? Sure, we can do that. So what we can do, now I can even do it like this. Let's assume I created as a class the product DTO, so it's not a record anymore, it's a class, okay? And then I say private int ID, private string name, and private double price. And you see what I did here now, do you? So I just made this product DTO mutable. And what we can do is that we can make sure this is transactional. I hope it works on the controller. Usually it should be on the service, okay? Or maybe we do it like this. Let's give a correct example, and they service, and then we say product service, and then this will be, of course, a service, and this will be transactional as well. And then this is where I'm going to refactor a bit my application. I'm going to take this here, delete this, and put it in the services. Define the constructor. And then what I'm going to do, I'm taking these two, I'm putting them here, and I take out the get mapping. So I now just made this to be like a real service, okay? And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the list here, and I'm going to go through it. And for each product, I'm going to set the price to 1000. Then I'm going to do the same thing here, okay? And then return list, okay? Same here. And then return list. And then in the controller, I'm going to say private final product service, and just call it, okay? So what happens, it's not name find all, it's get all, not find all, get all, and get all DTOs, okay. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to restart this, and let's try to see if we can call all DTOs again. So you see all DTOs now goes to the service is transactional. I made the DTOs mutable, which they shouldn't be. That's why at the very end it has been, I have been creating them as records, but now I changed them to be mutable to make this example as a comparison, okay? And then both methods do the same thing. Okay, so the constructor changed. Oh, sorry, so it's not that it changed, it's not there at all. It's not there at all, so I have to create the constructor, okay? So you see, it was failing. This exception is because not having the constructor, I couldn't, of course, call it here if it doesn't exist, okay? So that's why Spring Boot is very, very smart. It just checks all the queries and it says, well, this one seems not to be appropriate because I don't have the constructor. Because for the record, the constructor is out of the box, okay? You always, being immutable, you always have the all args constructor out of the box in records. Now, if I change it to a class, then I have to explicitly create it somehow. If I don't do that, then it's not there. So that's why I had this exception. Now it should start fine. Okay, a lot of seconds, but it started in the end. And going back to this project from yesterday where I created this, let me see if I can rerun. Okay, I rerun it and it retrieved 2, and the prices are 10 and 5. And then if I call the old DTOs, that does the change, okay? So I can call it multiple times and it does the change. So you will see the 1000 here, which is fine because I changed the value before sending them. It's not in the database, so be very careful. This is changed here, so you can clearly see that it changed on the object itself. But and that's why you see here 1000, because on the object it did change. But I don't expect to see the change in the database. So if I'm reselecting this here, you can see in the database the values are still 10 and 5. So even though I changed the price on the product and we could clearly see it here that the change has happened, it didn't change in the database. But if I'm going to do that on the old, okay, we see the value changed. It's the same logic behind the scenes. But when I reselect this, the values also changed in the database. So I think that's the answer for you, Benjamin, and it's a very good question. Thank you very much for asking it. I hope with this now the things are even more clear and you can see the very big difference. So you see that when I did that with DTOs, I called the endpoint multiple times. You saw that the values on the objects were changed, but you have seen that in the database no change happened. And the reason is on DTOs, they are, again, as we discussed, and that's the purpose of this video, they are outside of the JPA context. And because they are outside of the JPA context, whatever change you do on them, it doesn't reflect in the database. While when we changed for the entities, they are in the context, it's just enough to set a value on the object, and then at the very end of the transaction, Hibernate will make sure that the value mirrors from the context to the database, because that's what object relational mapping is all about. The difference between JPA and Hibernate is that the JPA is the specification, while Hibernate is an implementation. So you have a stream there, a full playlist about JPA and Hibernate, and I do recommend you watch that if you want to learn more about Hibernate and JPA fundamentals. It's not, of course, the purpose, and it would be impossible for me to discuss all about Hibernate in one video. But the purpose of this video, and I think we managed to cover it, we proved what means to use DTOs to grab data from the data source with a JPA implementation, such as Hibernate, which is the most used JPA implementation. We've seen how it acts differently between using entities and using DTOs. And you understood why and in which cases it's more relevant to use DTOs to grab data when you have a lot of values but you don't make changes on them. Then it makes more sense to grab them through DTOs, because this way you avoid Hibernate looking through a large context, and even if you didn't change anything, it will take a lot of time, okay? So whenever you have this situation, to spare Hibernate for looking and see if it has something to mirror using DTOs, which brings the objects outside of the context, makes more sense. And you see that the syntax is very easy to use. We just create an object of that type on the query itself, on the JPQL query, and automatically behind the scenes the objects will be created outside of the context, and you will not have to worry about that. So that's why, and again I want to stress it once more, normally it should be immutable. Whether it's a class or it's a record, don't make it mutable. I only now made it mutable at the very end to make the proof of difference for answering Benjamin's question. And of course, this again a very good question, because I think it makes a lot of sense to see at the very end that what we discuss here is indeed true. And what you saw is that indeed for the entities the mirror happened. For these DTOs, the mirror didn't happen. It's exactly what we expected. That's where all this comes from. So what about, let me see if we have other questions. We have just what about read-only true? That read-only true is not something on the JPA. That read-only true is something on specific to Spring, isn't it? And it makes the transaction read-only. So what you can do is that on the transaction here, which is a Spring annotation, you can use read-only. But that doesn't mean you just mark the transaction as read-only, you know. It doesn't mean that Hibernate will not look through the context. So first of all, even for Spring application using read-only true, it only means that whether you used entities or not, you will not see at the very end the changes to be mirrored, but you will not see them because of the transaction being made read-only, not because of Hibernate not trying to mirror the context. So it doesn't save you a lot of performance, or at least that's from my last research that I did. Moreover, what if you don't use Spring? Like I used Spring here. Okay, I have transactional read-only true. What if I don't use Spring? The things that I was telling you now, they are relevant for any usage of a JPA implementation, whether it's Spring or not, whether it's Spring Data or not. You can use it plain with just vanilla Java, and it will still work this way. I don't know what applications are you working on. They may be Spring or not, but what I'm telling you here, it's appropriate for any kind of Java application as long as it uses a JPA implementation. It can be Hibernate, it can be another implementation. This is a JPA thing, so it's a specification thing. So at the very end of the day, what we learned is that we can improve something in our JPA part of the world in our application to make it more performant in some situations. So someone created an ORM and it says that's giving better performance. Maybe, I don't know. If it's an internal one, if not, I can't say anything about it, because I'm discussing here about Hibernate, which is an open source project. It's public, or many people use it. I don't say is the best one. I'm just trying to prove a scenario on it. So yes, there might be other ORM frameworks which work better, but it's nothing I have personally investigated to give an answer on that. Okay, with that being said, and I hope I managed to clarify, and we are just a little bit over 1 hour, I will just put my project later on my repo so you can try it yourself. And I hope you enjoyed our today's video. I'm looking forward to more of your questions. I'm looking